The Spanish Grand Prix might have just taken position as my favourite race of the 2022 season so far. It had absolutely everything, drama from start to finish and battles all the way up and down the grid. I mean, just look at how it finished. It was absolute chaos for 66 laps. But as always, let's delve into our 3 winners and 3 losers from the Spanish Grand Prix. And our first winner, I mean, it can't be anyone else other than Max Verstappen, not only because he's won his 4th Grand Prix of the year, not only because he's won every single race he's finished, but also he has propelled himself to the top of the drivers' standings. And it looked like it was going to be a tricky race for Max Verstappen at one point. Charles Leclerc was disappearing off into the distance. He'd made that mistake into the gravel trap that had put him behind Sergio Perez and George Russell, and he seemed frustrated. We saw that frustration come out behind George Russell. Maybe those DNFs starting to come into his mind a little bit more. The fact that he was possibly going to lose out on points to Charles Leclerc again, and it all just boiled over as he was stuck behind George Russell, and that DRS just would not work. He kept hitting the button 50 times, he was saying, every single lap, and it was popping open, closing, and it wouldn't quite work for the Red Bull team, and Max Verstappen definitely let them know about it. But eventually, in the end, he did manage to pit stop, undercut George Russell, and from there was pretty much untouchable. By the end of the race, he was 13 seconds ahead of Sergio Perez, 32 seconds ahead of a reformed George Russell. But Sergio Perez did have something to say about it. Red Bull did jump to the top of the Constructors' Championship as well, and they need Sergio Perez to stay in that fight. Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz will be back at it again in the next round in Monaco. They need Sergio Perez on side, and he said, "We need to speak later as a team." Maybe the start of a little inkling of Sergio Perez not being quite so happy at Red Bull. Talking of Ferrari, they're dropping behind Red Bull in terms of the Constructors' Championship, and I think they have to be our first losers of the Spanish Grand Prix, especially Charles Leclerc in a Grand Prix where he qualified on pole and looked absolutely rapid in the first half of the Spanish Grand Prix, but it just all fell away when his engine malfunctioned. He had to come into the pits and retire for the rest of the race, dropping down to 20th place and losing out on all of those points. And as I said, Max Verstappen was getting a little bit frustrated that he wasn't able to battle with Charles Leclerc, but actually came up good for him when Charles Leclerc dropped out of the race. And I think it's interesting that actually this is the first DNF that we've seen from Ferrari. It was an engine issue, and it came when there's been a regulation change to the fuel temperatures. So fuel temperature used to be a flat 18 degrees. That was what you could do in Formula One. Now they've changed that regulation so that the fuel can be no more than 10 degrees C below the officially declared ambient temperature of the track. Now, that might have just been because it was exceptionally hot in Spain, but I think that rule change is interesting, and it's aligned itself with Ferrari's first engine issue. Maybe there's a parallel there. We'll have to wait and see on that one. Then, of course, we have to talk about Carlos Sainz as well, because he had another poor start to a Grand Prix. Another anti-stall issue on the grid meant that lap 1, he was just dropping down the order after a good qualifying from him. And again, he just needs something to go his way, I think, Carlos Sainz. Even in his home Grand Prix, just had no luck whatsoever. He was caught out by the wind into turn 4, into the gravel traps again. Thankfully, this time, he was able to continue to the end of the Grand Prix, but it's just not going his way. He's had a few Grand Prix now. I know that he got a podium in Miami, but it was a lackluster performance in Miami. He was never really closing in on those top dogs, and he just needs something. He needs that win. He needs something to go his way in that Ferrari over the next couple of races to really reinvigorate this season. Because at the moment, Carlos Sainz sitting in 5th place, still behind George Russell, who's been in a very up and down Mercedes. Well, I say ups and downs for Mercedes, but there are actually a lot less ups and downs for the Mercedes car over the course of the Spanish Grand Prix weekend, because they finally look like they've fixed that porpoising issue that they've had, mainly on the straights. There was still a little bit of it, especially in that really slow third sector, but they seem to have got a grips on the car a little bit better, and that's why they're my second winners of the Spanish Grand Prix. They just look revitalized. And let's talk about George Russell first, because obviously finishing up with the 3rd place finish and getting another podium in that Mercedes car is very, very impressive, and as we touched on, still ahead of Carlos Sainz in terms of the Drivers' Championship, and has really been the driving force of Mercedes in these first 6 races, and again, was just absolutely sublime. If you haven't seen some of the onboards of this podium finish for George Russell, especially that battle with Max Verstappen, it's just the belief in the car and the talent, the tenacity that George Russell has, which just enthralls me every single time he's in a car, to be honest with you. I think he's going to do exceptional things over the course of his Formula One career. Obviously, hasn't quite got the car to battle for wins right now, But I could see Mercedes continuing to improve, and I think George Russell could be up there for a couple of wins towards the end of the season. Maybe after the summer break, we'll see a brand new Mercedes again, more upgrades coming their way, and possibly they'll get even closer to the Ferraris and Red Bulls. Then, of course, we had Lewis Hamilton, ended up in 5th place overall in the Spanish Grand Prix, and it could have been much, much better. It felt like we were seeing a little bit of the Lewis Hamilton of old. Obviously, there was the moaning on the radio, and it was difficult to take, really, especially considering he then went on to finish in 5th place. Should have been 4th place from that position. He wanted to retire the car, but once he got into it, once the team had sort of convinced him to stay on the track, it was a sublime performance from the British driver. He just drove that car exquisitely. We've seen these performances from Lewis Hamilton before where he's at the back of the grid. Brazil last year is always the one I go to because just the way he drives past other drivers like they're not even there sometimes in that Mercedes car is sublime to watch. And obviously we've seen this earlier on in the season. Saudi Arabia didn't go his way, qualified poorly, and then got stuck. We did not see him get stuck now. He has so much more faith in that Mercedes car. And now that it's not bouncing around all the time, he really seems to be in the flow with it. And I think if you're looking at the top of the grid, you're Max Verstappen, you're Charles Leclerc, you're looking at that Hamilton performance, you're thinking, yeah, I could really do without him being right next to me in the next few Grand Prix. But let's have to wait and see. Mercedes are going to continually improve. They're actually kind of back to where they were in terms of qualifying, where they were in Bahrain. Other teams took steps forward. It took Mercedes a little while to get on top of this porpoising. Now they have. Maybe they can go on to win some races. Whilst Lewis Hamilton was able to sieve his way through the field, one man who couldn't do that was Kevin Magnussen, the man who came into collision with him. And Haas are my second losers of the Spanish Grand Prix, and I really wanted to put them in the winners category, especially after Saturday. Both cars in Q3 for the first time since 2019 in Brazil that both Haases have made it through into Q3. But the race itself just absolutely fell apart for the Haas team. Mick Schumacher finishing up in 14th place, Kevin Magnussen in 17th. And Kevin Magnussen, after that collision with Hamilton, you never know if he did have a little bit of damage, didn't quite go his way, never seemed to have the pace that he was showing on the Saturday. And similar for Mick Schumacher, race pace was just absolutely nowhere. I don't know what's happened to Mick Schumacher, whether he's just cursed, but every time it looks like he's about to get points, it just slips through his fingers, and it happened again in Spain. He just couldn't really put up a defense to those guys that were getting up behind him. You look at the Ricardos, the Vettels, the Tsunodas that managed to just drift their way past Mick Schumacher in towards those top 10 positions. Alonso, who we'll touch on later as well, because just no upgrades for Haas, obviously. They are the smallest team. I understand they've got the smallest budget, but I was just expecting a lot more in Barcelona. Maybe when those upgrades come in France, they'll show a little bit more of that pace that we've seen over the first few races. But whilst Haas let those points slip through their fingers, our midfield maestros were there again to pick up the pieces. Valtteri Bottas in 6th place, Esteban Ocon in 7th place, and Fernando Alonso in 9th place. I want to touch on those three because they were absolutely sublime over the Spanish Grand Prix weekend. Bottas, to begin with, just another exceptional drive from him. I thought he was going to put up a little bit more of a battle with the big boys. Thought we might see a little bit of Bottas versus George Russell. We know there's no love lost between those two. But in the end, he just settled for 6th place, ended up letting those guys past fairly easily. I think he knew that he wasn't really battling them on the day. Esteban Ocon, similar, had an exceptional race again, qualified so well, finished in 7th place, just behind Valtteri Bottas in the end. But another really, really good performance from the Frenchman, and I sing his praises every single weekend because I'm just so impressed with how consistent Esteban Ocon has been able to be. And of course, Fernando Alonso we have to touch on as well. He was getting told off by the FIA and the stewards at the beginning of the weekend for saying that the stewards were incompetent. Of course he was, it's Fernando Alonso, but he came back with a bang. Qualifying didn't go his way, ended up changing his engine, started in 20th place, finished up in 9th place, and the Spaniard was on fire. And this is the, Fernando Alonso that we want to see. Picked up some points, only a couple of points, puts himself now on 15th place, level with Sebastian Vettel, but I think there's much, much more to come from Alonso over the course of the season. It wouldn't surprise me if he jumps up towards the Ricciardo Magnussen area very, very soon. And my third and final losers of the Spanish Grand Prix, it has to be the green Red Bull of Aston Martin. After all the talk, all the controversy, all the media attention, I was ready with my pitchfork, I was ready with my midfield brethren to go after Aston Martin and the Stroll family and tell them that they had to change their car back to how it was. And it just wasn't any quicker than it was before. Both of the Aston Martins out in Q1. And then during the race, Sebastian Vettel finished in 11th place, didn't quite pick up points. Lance Stroll had a collision with Pierre Gasly and ended up 15th. Then neither of them picked up any points. And we kind of went back to the drawing board on that for Aston Martin. Didn't look any quicker than it was before, considering the massive upgrade haul that they did to their aerodynamics. Obviously, we'll see how that goes over the next few races. I don't think to the fact that just because they had one bad race means that everyone has kind of given them a bye on the fact that there's definitely some parallels between that car and the Red Bull car, but we'll have to wait and see. I don't want to, throw any allegations at them. I'm not Christian Horner, but that is all I've got to say about the Spanish Grand Prix. Overall, it was an exceptional weekend of racing. As I said at the top of the show, one of my favourite races of 2022 so far, and I'm looking forward to Monaco for the first time in a long time, because if Spain can be good, surely Monaco can be good as well. Let me know your favourite thing that happened in the Spanish Grand Prix in the comments down below. Leave a like whilst you're there. Subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you next time.